All right, we're continuing in our study of Ezekiel. We're ready for chapters 21, 22, and 23. If we'll come in just a moment, we're going to look at an outline of the book and then where we are and where we're going and how this all laces together. But if we had to give a summary of these chapters, chapter 21 would have to be the sword of the Lord is coming. Chapter 22 would have to be the sins of Jerusalem and what led to that. Chapter 23 would have to be about the parable of two harlots who both are doomed for destruction. And so that's basically where we're going. Now there's a lot of practical stuff in this, and I hope to bring some of that out as we go along, or as much of it as we can. Some very practical things that fit with us, that are very practical for our day and time. So this is not merely a study of what happened to Jerusalem. They're doomed because they did wrong, so what kind of thing, but it has some very practical things for us. Here is our outline of the book that we're following, 3 major sections. We're still in that first major section. We're talking about a disciplined nation. This is judgment on Jerusalem. Now we're going to shift gears in chapter 25 soon. And in chapter 25, we'll start in on the nations section, as we often talk about in Isaiah and Jeremiah and other prophets, the nations section. But we're still talking about Jerusalem now. And keep in mind, lest we forget, that there has been one invasion of Jerusalem and people have gone into captivity. There's been a second invasion. Ezekiel was in that group. They went into captivity. And there's going to be a third wherein Jerusalem falls and the nation is over. And so they're completely in captivity and will be for 70 years. Well, there were some false prophets who were saying the third invasion is not going to happen. Or if it is an invasion, Jerusalem is not going to fall. They were prophesying saying that it was not going to happen. And so that's what much of the book is about. It is going to happen. And when you come to find out that it does happen, then you'll know that I'm the Lord. And so we see that phrase time and time again. So we're in this disciplined nation section. Now within the disciplined nation section, we saw in 12 to 19, we saw this principle, the certainty of destruction upon a sinful nation. And then we see, and I'm using Harkrider's wording of this, the prediction of destruction, or the prophecy, I prefer to call it, of the destruction of Judah and Jerusalem in 20 to 24. And that's where we are. Now in that, we saw Israel's rebellion in chapter 20, the future restoration in chapter 20, and now we're in this section where judgment is soon to come against Jerusalem. It's going to fall. It's coming. And we pointed out that there are 2 dates that were given earlier. One was in chapter 20. We're within 5 to 6 years of this nation falling. And so it's in a short time. We're not talking about from the time of the prophet that it's going to be 50, 70 years from now, but just in a short period of time, the nation is going to completely collapse and fall, and Jerusalem will fall. So in this section, judgment is soon to come. There was the parable of the burning forest kindled by the Lord, and now we're ready to pick up and talk about some continuing thoughts of this judgment coming. So let's look at verses 1 to 7. This is about the sword of the Lord is coming. The idea of the sword of the Lord is simply God's judgment pictured with a sword. Now there is a graphic description that is given, and this is in agreement with other cases of what Ezekiel has dealt with, where he's given graphic demonstrations, such as marching as if he's going off to captivity, lying on his side, and playing out this siege. There's a couple of those here in our chapters tonight. Now I want to back up just for a moment at the end of chapter 20, because chapter 21 gives somewhat of an answer to that. You remember at verse 49, then I said, "O Lord God, they say to me, does he not speak in parables?" In other words, he keeps speaking in these parables, and it seems, as we pointed out last week, that Ezekiel is protesting the ambiguity of the message that's being delivered, perhaps thinking it needs to be more specific. And if that be the case, and I'll leave that for you to judge, verse 1, Jerusalem is specified. And so there is no doubt what we're talking about. There is no questioning. There is no ambiguity anymore, if there was at all previous to this. That Jerusalem is specified, and there's no more question about parables or about what the parables mean. There's no ambiguity. There's no lack of clarity. And so notice what he said. The word of the Lord came to me saying, "Son of man, set your face toward Jerusalem and preach Your translation may say prophesy. So everyone will use this term preach. That's what prophesying was about. Preach. Preach against the holy places and prophesy against the land of Israel. You let it be known. We're talking about Jerusalem. There is no ambiguity. This isn't a parable this time. There are parables, and there's a place for parables, and there's a place for the demonstration or the illustration, but this is with clarity. And say to them, thus says the Lord, I will draw out my sword out of its sheath and cut off both the righteous and the wicked from you. Now that doesn't sound like what we were expecting to hear if this is your cursory reading of this text. Then I'm going to cut off both the righteous and the wicked. I could see God cutting off the wicked, but what do I learn from that? And you have a question in your handout about that. What I learned from that is this, that there are times the righteous suffer because of the wicked. Were there still righteous people in Jerusalem? Well, certainly so. They were not 100%. Every single person was ungodly. There's still some righteous people there, or there would never have been a remnant. But I'm learning the righteous often suffer because of the wicked. And maybe this is a poor illustration, but let's just suppose in this congregation there were only 3 righteous souls and everybody else went wicked, and so the church just disintegrates and is gone here. But there's still 3 righteous people. Well, those righteous are suffering because the church no longer existed. They have to go worship somewhere else. While everybody else went into wickedness, there are 3 righteous souls, though. And they're suffering because of all the wickedness of others, and that happens. But there's something else to be learned from this. And I want you to notice with me in Isaiah chapter, let's go to Isaiah 57 and verse 1. Isaiah 57 and in verse 1. And what I'm learning from this is sometimes the righteous die in order to be spared. And perhaps that's included here. And I cite Isaiah 57:1. I'm going to read from the New International, which is it's a free, eclectic kind of translation, and it's not the best of translations, but I think they captured the thought. And you read your translation along with me and get the point, though, of what the New International says. The righteous perish, and no one takes it to heart. The devout are taken away, and no one understands that the righteous are taken away to be spared from evil. I don't know about you, but I've known of some people who died, and I wondered, what on earth? Not that I'm questioning why did God, but why did they have to die? And then something happened later, and I'm thinking, I'm glad they died when they did, because they didn't live to see this. And perhaps that's part of that. But anyway, I pass that on. You're looking for that in your handout. So I'm going to cut off the righteous as well as the wicked. That verse 5, they may know that I, the Lord, have drawn the sword out of its sheath. They're going to understand. And notice at verse 6, he says, sigh before them. In other words, you make it clear to them that you're sighing about this message. And then verse 7, they're going to come to you and say, why are you sighing? You got a question about this, I think. And you're going to tell them it's because of the news when it comes, every evil heart will melt, all hands will be feeble, and every spirit will faint, and all knees will be weak as water. Well, it's something I learned from verse 7. And I'll learn something about telling the people about their sin and their error indeed is sad. And there is no delight on the part of Ezekiel or on the part of God in telling them of that. You sigh and you tell them when they ask, what are you sighing about? I'm sighing about this sad news. You see more about that at verse 12. All right, that gets us through verse 7. And so here the sword of the Lord is coming. Now beginning at verse 8, the sword is prepared for impartial justice. I want you to watch for this impartial justice here, because you have a question about the impartiality of God's sword is seen in that it will strike what? Well, let's see what it strikes. And I get the picture a little later, and I'll point this out when we get to it, where Ezekiel seems to be using a sword as a prop. That is, he's prophesying and preaching, he's using a sword and talking about thrusting it to the right and thrusting it to the left, and God's going to pull his sword out of its sheath, and God's ready to execute judgment. And so with this sword perhaps in his hand, he said, Son of man, prophesy and say to them, a sword is sharpened and is polished. It's ready for battle. And sharpened to make a dreadful slaughter, polished like the flash of lightning. Shall we make mirth? In other words, shall we rejoice? It despises the scepter of my son. Now there's your point that you're looking for. This sword is impartial in that it not only strikes foreign kings, which it had and it will, but it also strikes the Davidic kingdom. And it did here. Zedekiah is about to be taken. And so the Davidic kingdom, the scepter of David, is taken. It's an impartial, as it does all the wood. And so it's polished and ready. Now, let's stop and pause just for a minute. Let's go on down through verse 12, and then we'll go further. It says, cry, son, for it is against, here you're looking for this expression, my people, and against the princes of Israel. It is an impartial sword. Now, let's get a couple of practical things from that. McGuigan observes that family connection is not what God is interested in, but in holiness. You may be in the family of God. You may have been the Jews, but that doesn't matter anymore. What God cares about is holiness. It doesn't matter whether you're a Jew in the day of Judah or you are a Gentile. If you're in sin, God's sword is drawn against you. No one is so important that they don't answer to God. It doesn't matter who you are. You may be an elder, you may be a preacher, you may be a song leader, you may be a deacon, you may be head of the household. Whoever you are, you're not so important that you don't answer to God. Now let's go at the end of verse 12. This suggests to me at the end of verse 12, therefore strike your thigh. In other words, drive the passage home. We saw about striking the hands earlier. And drive your message home. Well, strike your thigh. Curtis Porter used to do that in his debates when he was driving a point home. He would kneel down and squat and slap his leg when he drives a point home. Well, that's what Ezekiel was to do here. Slap your thigh. Drive this point home. Be vigorous. Strike your hands together, verse 12. And it seems he's using the sword as a prop, as I mentioned earlier. He said, it is the sword that slays. I'm reading at verse 14. And swords at the ready, verse 16. I realize I'm skipping some points, but in interest of time, I've set the point, backing up to verse 15, I've set the point of the sword against all the gates. And God, this is God saying this, or verse 16, that thrust right and set your blade and thrust left. And where is the edge ordered? In other words, God has ordered this sword to go in all directions, right into the left. Now notice at verse 17, you might make a marginal note to see chapter 22 and verse 13, and when we get there, we'll make a note back to 21 and 17. God said, I will beat my fists together. This is God speaking, not Ezekiel saying, I'll beat my fists together. And it seems to be in indignation and in anger and his wrath that God beats his fists together because of what's going on. And so I'm pulling my sword out. Now beginning at verse 18 now. We're ready to talk about the sword of Nebuchadnezzar will come against Jerusalem. Now, this is interesting to me because God has just said, I'm pulling my sword out. But then he turns at verse 19 and said, O son of man, appoint to yourself 2 ways for the sword of the king of Babylon. I just learned something about how God operates. God operates through human instrumentality. You see, when God brings judgment upon Jerusalem, he said, that's me pulling my sword out and I'm using the sword against you. But then he calls it the sword of the king of Babylon. I thought it's the sword of the Lord. And I know the Lord and the king of Babylon is not the same. That's true. But the Lord uses the sword of the king of Babylon. So when the king of Babylon comes in, God is using him. God uses human instrumentality. Here seems to be another demonstration, maybe a prop if you prefer. After using the sword to get their attention, and he's preaching to the people and he's using the sword has been polished and is ready for battle. Then he seems to use some signs. So beginning at verse 18 now, he talks about the sword of the king of Babylon is coming. And he's going to come from the same place, but he said, appoint for yourself 2 ways for the sword of the king of Babylon. Both of them shall go from the same land, and make a sign and put a head at the head of the road to the city, and appoint a road to the sword for Rabbah of the Ammonites and to Judah into the fortified Jerusalem. In other words, it seems at this point, God knows, but the people don't know if Nebuchadnezzar comes with his army, which way is he going to go first? Is he going to go into Ammon and then come into Judah, or is he going to go to Jerusalem first? Well, he came to Jerusalem first, but they don't know that. So it seems that God is having Ezekiel, maybe he didn't do this, but the wording seems to me that he's saying, Ezekiel, you go out and put a sign up at the road, and then people are going to start raising questions. What are you doing, Ezekiel? Well, here's a sign, and this road goes to Ammon, to Rabbah of Ammon, of the Ammonites, and this one goes to the city of Jerusalem in Judah. And what's this about? Well, this is showing the king of Babylon when he comes through with his sword, and he's ready to do it bad, he can see which way he wants to go. And that he does. So when the king comes, verse 21, he's going to stand and he's going to try to determine which way to go. How does he determine it? You're looking for this. There are three ways. And what are the three ways he does that? There's the shaking of the arrows, the consulting of the images, and the looking at the liver. That seems strange to us. That's not unusual for the pagan. The shaking of the arrows is much like the drawing of the straw. Perhaps an arrow marked Ammon, and in his quiver, he has the Ammon, one that's labeled Ammon, one named Jerusalem, and he shakes them up and jostles them, and he pulls one out, and, well, Jerusalem, that's where we're going. But let's make sure. He consults the images, consults his gods. He's a pagan, by the way. And the third one is kind of strange to us, but the looking at the liver. McGuigan observes that probably referred to the taking of a dead animal, killing an animal, take that liver from the dead animal, and if the lower end of the liver was in good shape, that was a favorable sign. If it was in bad shape, then it was a negative sign. So should I go to Jerusalem? He kills the animal, looks at the liver, looks good, let's go to Jerusalem. Well, that seems strange, but he's going to come to the crossroads and he's going to make the decision, which way shall I go? Well, he chooses to go toward Jerusalem, is the point. Now, I want you to notice before we get through with that section, in his right hand, verse 22, is a divination for Jerusalem to set up battering rams and a call for slaughter, and lift up his voice of shouting, set up battering rams and lay siege mound and build a wall. In other words, he's coming in, and the people are going to think that that's just a false divination but what's going to happen is the sword's coming and it's going to fall upon Jerusalem. That's the point to be made. So the sword of Nebuchadnezzar is going to make it to Jerusalem. Now Zedekiah is going to fall. Now who is Zedekiah? We're going to come back to that outline. Zedekiah, I have circled here, is the last king. And so here we have the kings. This right here is the kings, the last kings in Judah, and then they go off into captivity, and Zedekiah is the last of those kings, and this is talking about Zedekiah. So let's back up now and see what we learn about Zedekiah. Zedekiah's fall is promised. That while the prophets are saying it's not going to happen, Zedekiah is going to fall. Therefore, beginning at verse 24, thus says the Lord, because you've made your iniquity to be remembered, in that your transgressions are in all your doings, your sins appear, because you have come to remembrance, you shall be taken in hand. Now, notice at verse 25, O profane wicked prince of Israel, whose day has come, whose iniquity shall end. You're going to fall. It's going to happen. You're going to fall. Now, if you're following your handout, turn over on the back, look at the very last question, and are there any passages that deal with the Messiah? Well, here's one. And I think that's at verse 27. So let's get verse 26 and come lead into verse 27. Therefore, thus says the Lord, remove the turban and take off the crown. Nothing shall remain the same. Exalt the lowly and abase the exalted. Overthrown, overthrown. I will make it overthrown. It shall be no longer. Now, we'll come back to the Messiah. What he's saying is, as if he's prophesying directly to Zedekiah, take off your crown, take off your turban. It's over. Your day's over. You're about to fall. You're not going to be a king. The kingdom's over until the Davidic kingdom is over. Until he comes whose right it is, and I will give it to him. I think that's the Messiah. I take that to be the Messiah. That's the best I can do with that. I can't make that any other king. In other words, I'm going to take this king off the throne, and no one else is going to sit on the throne of David until he whose right it is. That is seemingly a prophecy of the Messiah. All right, now that gets us through verse 27. So judgment is soon to come against Jerusalem is what we've just been seeing. The sword is coming. It's going to be an impartial sword. The sword of Nebuchadnezzar, which is the sword of the Lord, is coming against Jerusalem, and Zedekiah is going to fall. All right, Now then, we're going to pick up at verse 28. We're at point D here. The Ammonites will also be slain. Now, remember the crossroads? There's the crossroads, and he pulls out his sword, his arrow. He consults his images, and he looks at the liver and decides to go toward Jerusalem. Well, Ammon, are you free from the invasion? Not at all. So let's get verses 28 through the end of the chapter. That's 28 to 32. The Ammonites are going to be slain too. Well, who are the Ammonites? Right here. To give you kind of a bearing, this is the Jordan River, and this is the Dead Sea. And over here, we have the nation of Ammon, the Ammonites. So let's see about the Ammonites. We won't spend much time here, beginning at verse 28. Notice, prophesy concerning the Ammonites, concerning the reproach. A sword is drawn. Drop down to verse 29. Whose day has come. Verse 32. You shall be fuel for the fire, and you will not be remembered, for I, the Lord, have spoken. God viewed them as fuel for the fire. Your day has come. Ammon is going to be destroyed as well. All right, now let's move into chapter 22. Chapter 22 deals with the sins of Judah and Israel. Now, there's three things that happen here. We have Jerusalem is guilty of shedding blood and must be judged. There's more than just shedding blood. We're going to list those sins. And they're going to be refined as if in a smeltering furnace, and then destruction is coming because the leaders were corrupt. Now, I said earlier, as I gave a summary of chapter 22, that if we had to give a summary, it would be their sins and what led to those sins. And that gets quite interesting to me. Now, you're looking for, in your handout, the sins of Judah or Jerusalem, and here they are. This is them. Let's work through them. All right. So, judgment is coming. The sword is coming. But God never, ever tells people you're going to be punished without telling them why. So no one should be surprised. And here's a footnote. No one should be surprised at the day of judgment. No, wait a minute, Lord, I don't understand why I'm lost. Judah and Jerusalem know why they are facing destruction. Here's why. So he said, beginning at verse 2, Son of man, will you judge? Will you judge the bloody city? Show all of her abominations. Let her know what she did wrong. What did she do? Well, let's look at verses 1 to 6, down through 3 to 6 here. The city sheds blood in its own midst, and she makes idols. I didn't list the idols there, but that would be part of this forgetting God down at verse 12. But she sheds blood. You're guilty of shedding blood, verse 4. Look at verse 6. Look, the princes of Israel, each one of you has used his power to shed blood in you. No respect for others. So one of the charges is she has shed blood. No regard for God's law of Exodus 20. Deuteronomy 5, another text. Let's drop down to verse 7. I know that's a quick summary. There's more to verses 1 to 6 than that, but they are guilty of idolatry, which has been mentioned time and again, but they are shedding of blood. Well, one of the things about shedding of blood was they shed the blood of their own children in the offering their sacrifice to Molech. Well, notice at verse 7, here's one of the things they did. They oppressed and mistreated others. In that they made light of the father and mother. In the midst they have oppressed the stranger, and they have mistreated the fatherless and the widows. So they don't seem to have much respect for those who may be in need, whether it be the fatherless or the widows. They have oppressed others, mistreated others. Verse 8, they have no respect for that which is holy. You despise my holy things and profane my Sabbath. I wonder if that doesn't, I doubt any one of us present have shed blood. We may have mistreated someone else, but it's more likely that we've been guilty of not respecting that which is holy. It may be the Lord's church, it may be His Word, it may be God Himself, where we didn't show the proper respect. That we could be guilty of the very same thing, not showing respect for that which is holy. That was part of their problem. But that's not all. Look at verse 9a. In you are men who slaughter to cause bloodshed, a slander to cause bloodshed. In you are those who eat on the mountains in your midst and commit lewdness. What am I learning from that? Well, they've been influenced by the heathen. You let the heathens influence you. Well, let's go further at verse 9b. They were immoral. They committed lewdness. You see more of that at verse 9. And you men uncover their father's nakedness, and you violate the women who are set apart for their impurity. Incest. So you see how far they've gone. They're serving idols. They're shedding blood. They are immoral. They uncover their father's nakedness, and they're guilty of incest. Look at verse 12 now. They are dishonest. They take bribes to shed blood. They take usury to increase, that they make profit from their neighbors by extortion. And so they're dishonest in their gain. And verse 12, they have forgotten me, says the Lord. They forgot all about me. So there's your list of the sins. Why is God bringing the sword and pulled the sword out and said, let the sword shine like and flash like lightning and to the right and to the left, and I'm not putting it back until the slaughter has come? It's because of that. Now look at verse 13. Put a note to the side that you need to see chapter 21, verse 17. We did that one a while ago. They're connecting these two verses. And here again is that I beat my fist at the dishonest prophet. So God is upset about that. God is beating his fist together over the anger and the wrath that is stirred over their sin. Now, I will scatter you, verse 15 says, and then here you might underline at the end of verse 16, then shall you know that I'm the Lord. I'm going to bring punishment and judgment upon you, and then you're going to know that indeed I am the Lord. Now, let's start at verse 17. We're at point E2. Jerusalem will be refined as in a smeltering furnace. Now, you've got a question about this at verse 18 and your handout. He said, Son of man, the house of Israel has become dross to me. What is dross? They are all bronze, tin, and iron, and lead in the midst of the furnace. They have become dross from silver. When you take silver or gold, let's take silver as it's mentioned in the text, and you put it through the fire, what it does is it burns off the impurities. That which is worthless and useless, and you call that the dross. So what God is saying, you've become useless to me. You're not like gold. You're not like silver. You're not of value. You're useless to me. Why are you useless to me? You're useless to me because of this, because of the sin. That's why you're useless. You've become like dross to me, he said. Now, therefore, verse 19. Therefore says the Lord, because you have all become dross, therefore behold, I will gather you in the midst of Jerusalem as men gather silver. In other words, I'm going to gather you up and pass you through the fire. Just like men gather up silver and bronze and lead and iron, and they blow fire on it and they push it through the fire to see what's going to happen. Notice at verse 22, he said, as silver is melted in the midst of the furnace, so you shall be melted in its midst, and then shall you know, here's your phrase and underline, that I am the Lord who's poured it out. You're going to know that. And so I'm going to put you through the fire of the furnace and burn out that impurity is what I'm going to do. You become dross. You're useless. Now, let's stop and think about that just for a moment. Do you think God would ever tell you you're like gold? You're valuable to me. Or you're silver? Or is it the way that I live that God said, you're dross. You're useless to me. You're of no value to me. You do nothing to produce anything for me. Let's begin at verse 23. 23 to verse 31, destruction is coming because their leaders are corrupt. Now, I think we have a question about the leaders, what the leaders did. What do we learn about the danger of false teachers? Well, I want you to, you might underline some of the leaders. In fact, let's list them and then we'll come back and talk about them. At verse 25, you might underline prophets. Verse 26, the priest. Verse 27, the princes. And then he mentions again the prophets at verse 28. Here's what I'm learning from that. We'll come back and deal with some of the details. That as the leaders go, so go the people. The leaders are corrupt, the nation became corrupt. Well, that happens in the family. If the leadership in the family is corrupt, then the family is going to be corrupt. If the leader's weak, the family's weak. In the church, if leaders are weak, the church is going to be weak. As the leaders go, so go the people. And we see that here. Look at verse 25. We have a question about this. He said, the conspiracy of their prophets in their midst. A like a roaring lion tearing the prey, and they've devoured the people and have taken treasure and precious things, and they made many widows in their midst. He pictures the false prophets like lions coming in and tearing the prey. Here's what I want you to see in that. What do we learn? The question in your handout is about the danger of false teachers. False teachers are not just over here babbling and chewing bubble gum, and it really doesn't matter because they're not doing any damage. They're tearing the prey. They're ripping souls apart. They're destroying lives. And in some cases, destroying churches and destroying homes and families. They're destroying morality. They're doing damage. That's why we need to preach against it. That's why we need to refute the error. But I'm more interested about the priest, verse 26. What did the priest done? Well, he said they violated my law and profaned my holy things. They have not distinguished between holy and unholy, nor have they made any difference between the unclean and the clean. In other words, they blurred the lines. Sound familiar? There should be a clear distinction between clean and unclean, between holy and unholy. They blurred the lines. Philippians 1 says we need to learn to distinguish things that differ. When we start blurring the lines between faith and opinion, we've got troubles. When we blur the lines between the individual and the church, between sin and bad judgment, between that which is social and that which is spiritual, we blur those lines. We're leading people astray. Or we may admit, there's a distinction, but we kind of blur where it's kind of hard to tell what is what. And so when we blur those distinct lines, that's what the priests were doing. Things that were unclean, they were calling clean. They blurred the line. They led the people astray. Well, the princes, I take that to be the kings. The kings were corrupt, as you know. There was not a good king in the north and very few good ones in the south. But they're like wolves tearing the prey and they're shedding blood. The prophets have plastered with untempered mortar. And they say the Lord God, and when the Lord hadn't spoken, they're saying they make up their messages. Look at verse 30. I sought for a man among them who would make a wall and stand in the gap before me on behalf of the land, that I should not destroy it. The question is, God was looking for somebody to stand up for what was right, to stand in the gap, to defend this nation, to defend this land, to keep God from destroying. I look for a leader. I look for a prophet. I look for princes. I look for a priest to stand in the gap and fill in where there was something missing. And notice his answer at verse 30. He said, but I found none. Found no one. You see, God's looking for fathers to take the lead in the home. God's looking for elders to lead. God's looking for teachers to teach. God's looking for someone to stand against immorality. God's looking for someone to stand against worldliness. God's looking for someone to take their stand for what's right, for godliness. And you may look around and say, I'm not finding as many as I thought. What a sad picture. Therefore, I've poured out my indignation on them. That's the end of chapter 22. Destruction is coming because the leaders are corrupt. So here's the list of their sins, and the reason for that is they had corrupt leadership. Now then, let's go to chapter 23. There's the parable of the two immoral sisters. We'll spend the rest of our time there. There are two immoral sisters in chapter 23, and there are 5 points to be made in this chapter. And there are two sisters, and so we can, I think, quickly get the gist of this in the time that we have left. And so here is a parable. Now, remember, it seems, and you may disagree with me, and that's fine, and you may be right, that at the end of chapter 20, it's like, he said, they say to me, does he not speak in parables? In other words, it almost seems as if Ezekiel was questioning, should I speak to them in parables? Well, God's not through with parables. He's going to speak more parables. But God did speak with great clarity when he specified Jerusalem. But anyway, be that as it may, here's another parable. And he said, Son of man, there were two women, the daughters of the same mother. And they committed harlotry in Egypt. Now, let's get ahead of ourselves and we'll come back to Egypt. They grew and they blossomed and they became, and their names was Aholah, the older one, and Aholabah was the younger one. Now you're looking for this in your handout if you haven't already read ahead. Look at verse 4. Samaria, that's the northern kingdom of Israel, is Aholah. And Jerusalem, Judah, the southern kingdom, is Aholabah. Now, that's the two sisters. There is unity, saying they were of the same mother. And furthermore, they learned their harlotry, and that's what we're learning right here. Their wickedness began in Egypt. They began to learn about idolatry while they were down in Egypt, before they ever became two separate nations. And so they learned their harlotry, and they never quit it. They brought it out with them, and they carried it on, and they continued on with that. Now, let's begin at verse 5. He talks about the harlotry of Samaria and her just judgment. She played the harlot, verse 5. Even though she was mine, and she lusted after her lovers. And drop down to verse 8. She has never given up her harlotry brought from Egypt. See, this has been an ongoing problem. It's not that they had a problem down in Egypt and got clean of that and gave it up and they lived good and right for years and years and years, and now they've fallen off the wagon again. No. They didn't seem to give up their idolatry since the days of Egypt. Therefore, I have delivered her in the hands of her lovers into the hands of the Assyrians. You might put a marginal note, 722 BC. That's when the nation fell. The northern kingdom of Israel fell. And so they fell. And he said, they uncovered her nakedness and took away her sons and daughters. Now, we won't have time to develop this, but several times, 2 or 3 times in this chapter, he talks about uncovering their nakedness. It reminds me of Isaiah's statement where God is going to embarrass Babylon, expose Babylon. And he says, I'll lift her skirt and expose her thigh and let her nakedness be seen. That was supposed to be embarrassing. So in ancient times, in biblical times, to reveal your nakedness was embarrassing. God said, they're going to see the nakedness of Israel when she goes into captivity. I'm going to expose her for what she is. Now, beginning at verse 11, you've got a question. What is it that Aholabah failed to do? She failed to learn from her sister. It's kind of like two kids. Here's the older child and here's the younger child. The older child misbehaves and refuses to obey the parents and gets in trouble, and the younger child watches that and learns from that and then does the same thing. They didn't slow learners. Because they should have learned, you know what? I saw my sister do that, or my brother do that, and they got in trouble, and I'll get in trouble too. So look at verse 11. Although her sister Aholabah saw this, she became more corrupt than her inordinate love, than she, and in her harlotry, more corrupt than her sister's harlotry. She was even worse. Although she saw that, reminds me of Daniel 5, that although you knew all of this, although you knew that, well, I'm wondering if God at the day of judgment may tell us, even though you knew this, you knew better, yet you did the same thing you saw in others. Well, notice now, she lusted after her neighboring Assyrians, and her eyes saw and lusted after them, verse 16. Look at verse 17. Then the Babylonians came to her into the bed of love. In other words, she committed her harlotry. She committed harlotry, look at verse 19, with Egypt. That was calling for help from Egypt to defend them against the Babylonians, and that was God considering that as harlotry, and so they're going to face judgment. So he talks about the harlotry. Now he talks about the judgment, verses 22 to 35. So what's going to happen to her? Well, he said, I'm going to stir up your lovers against you, verse 22. Now, who is he going to bring? Look at verse 23. We already know this, but he specifies the Babylonians, all the Chaldeans. Pekod, Shoah, and Koah. These may be proper names or these may be tribes. But these are Babylonians that are coming. These are the Chaldeans that are coming. And look at verse 24. They'll come up against you with chariots and war horses, and they're coming against you to fight. And they're going to, look at verse 26, they will strip you of your clothes, is what's going to happen. In other words, they're going to expose your nakedness, and they'll take away your jewelry. In other words, you're going to face this judgment and this punishment. Now drop down to verse 30. I will do these things because you've gone as a harlot after the Gentiles. You went after the Gentiles. You were corrupted by the Gentiles, and that's why I'm doing that. Now look at verse 32. You shall drink of your sister's cup, deep and wide. There's going to be, verse 33, horror and desolation. In other words, you watched your sister go into harlotry, and she drank of the cup of corruption, the cup of punishment, and you're going to drink from that same cup. In fact, you're going to drink it very deep and very wide. It's going to be a big cup that you're going to get, just like your sister got. Now look at verse 35. Because you have forgotten me and cast me behind your back. It's like they took God and just threw God behind them. I don't have any use for God anymore, and we throw him behind us. That's what they did. Now let's finish up the chapter in the time we have. There's a further indictment of the two sisters. So he talks about them together. They started their harlotry in Egypt. Then he turns to the older sister. Here's what she did, what she faced. He turns to the younger sister, Judah. Here's what she did, and then here's what she faced. Then he wraps them together and talks about here's a further indictment to the sins of the two sisters. Let's see this. We have just a few points and see what those sins are. In fact, I think what charges are laid in verses 36 to 49, here they are. Here's the first. There's the idolatry. Look at verse 37. For they have committed adultery, and blood is on their hands. They have committed adultery with their idols. So there's idolatry. That's what their problem. Both of them did. Both sisters did. They caused their children to pass through the fire. Verse 37b, that's Molech. Taking their children and offering them as a sacrifice to this idol. Their own children, burning them in sacrifice to idol. We often look at how could Abraham have drawn back the knife, ready to kill his son and sacrifice to God. I'm more puzzled, how could you take your child and burn it in sacrifice to what you know to be an idol that was man-made? That they did. Here's a third thing. Verse 39, there was hypocrisy. For after they'd slain their children, on the same day they came into my sanctuary. Now, can you imagine? They go over here and burn their children in sacrifice to Moloch, and then they go over here to the sanctuary and try to worship God. God says, that's hypocrisy. I have no use for that. That's profaning my sanctuary. Get out of my sanctuary. I don't want that in there. It's no use. Drop down to verse 42. The sound of the carefree multitude was with her. She's surrounded by people who don't care. They don't care about God. They don't care about others. They don't care about themselves. Interesting phrase, the carefree multitude. Are you surrounded by a carefree multitude? Let's drop down to verse 49, the end of the chapter, and then we're going to look, hopefully have time for a practical lesson or two. Then they shall repay you for your lewdness and pay you for your idolatrous sins. Then, here's your phrase you might underline, they shall know that I am the Lord. There's several practical things to be learned from these chapters. Time would forbid us to talk about all of those. One of the greatest practical things to learn is the time is coming when we pay a price for the things that we have done. When the leaders are corrupt, the whole nation becomes corrupt, or the whole church, or the whole family becomes corrupt. We'll stop at that. We are done. We'll pick up with chapter 24 next time.